Now, when I say your name in the show, is it Kuchuck?
Well, I actually pronounce it Smith, but if you're going to go by the spelling, yeah, Kuchuck.
That's good.
I don't think you have any notion of the true strengths and depths of the opposition to our work. There's the whole medical establishment, of course, baying to send Freud to the auto da fe. But that's as nothing compared to what happens when our ideas begin to trickle through in whatever garbled form they're relayed to the public. The denials, the frenzy, the incoherent rage.
But might that not be caused by your insistence on the exclusively sexual interpretation of the clinical material?
All I'm doing is pointing out what experience indicates to me must be the truth. And I can assure you that in 100 years' time, our work will still be rejected. Columbus, you know, had no idea what country he'd discovered. Like him, I'm in the dark. All I know is I've set foot on the shore, and the country exists.
I think of you more as Galileo, and your opponents as those who condemned him, while refusing even to put their eye to his telescope.
In any event, I've simply opened a door. It's for the young men like yourself to walk through it.
I'm John Totten, and this is Between Us. Hello.
Hello, hello.
I have a lot of questions. Your name is a name that I feel like comes across my desk on almost every book, in at least an editorial capacity.
Supposedly the first word I ever spoke was book.
I tend to have seen the work you've done over the years as being somewhat of a guardian, a historian, a presenter of a certain perspective.
What a nice way to look at it and see it. I don't think I've thought of it in those terms, but that resonates for me. I'm passionate about psychoanalysis. That's something I've been around in one way or another since a young age. I am interested in the work of others. So you're right. I like to mentor younger people in the field. I like to work with senior people in the field. And then I like to introduce my own ideas.
So I keep saying this because it keeps failing, but we set out to have a season without themes. And that included not having to address much of what was happening in the world. I started recording this season a long time ago, and I wanted it to be timeless so as not to highlight how slow we are at this. But then, towards the end of production, the ever-tense relations between the nation of Israel and besieged Palestinians of Gaza escalated for a new iteration of a seemingly permanent conflict. I only know people, especially psychotherapists, who speak of it in one way, that it's horrifying. As of my recording today, nearly 20,000 Palestinian civilians, many of them children, have been killed. Along with 1,200 dead innocent Israelis, the amount of suffering is inconceivable. The situation is complex in that trauma histories can be complex. The Israeli Jews still reel from the effects of the Holocaust, and that unprocessed psychological pain becomes contagious. It can seem to defy simple understandings. That people aren't just randomly bad, but that they're damaged and then they do bad things. We didn't speak about it to today's guest because it had not become escalated in the way that it's escalated right now when we spoke. But in a way, this is an interview that addresses badness in all of us. The ways in which we scapegoat bad characters, the efforts we make to be perceived as good, the dark side that we all have. I find the societal discourse around Israel to reflect these tendencies. That we each want to be seen as good, and that often requires someone to take the blame. Our guest today is concerned with relational psychoanalysis and how it can offer hope and change, and the important role played by the analyst's subjectivity in this process. At one point in the interview, he alludes to Irvin Yalom in The Gift of Therapy when he writes, "Therapists must be familiar with their own dark side and be able to empathize with all human wishes and impulses. All human wishes and impulses seems more radical than ever these days. That we as therapists might not be concerned with presenting ourselves as good as much as we are concerned with understanding the full goodness and full badness of humanity. Stephen Kuchuck is a psychoanalyst, writer, editor, and teacher in New York. He is the co-editor of the Relational Perspective series from Routledge. Many of those authors have been on this show before. In his own book, The Relational Revolution in Psychoanalysis and Psychotherapy, came out in 2021. He sat down with me from New York to discuss the analyst's subjectivity, as well as some of his favorite bad characters from the history of psychoanalysis, and what draws him to those who fall out of favor. I am aware that something that you're quite interested in is the subjectivity of the analyst and what the personhood they bring to the work. I'm also aware doing this show that sometimes featuring others is a way of making my own subjectivity known.
So this is the second time, and we only just started speaking, that you said something that I don't know I've had the conscious words for before, but it's really resonating. Yeah, we find ourselves in others. We find ourselves in others and through and with others. So curating and highlighting and editing the work of others helps me to be more in touch with some of the ways I think. And I can imagine how that must be part of having a podcast as well. It's appreciate that way of looking at this. Yeah, look, that's a core part of how we see relational psychoanalysis, object seeking. And we develop and evolve as humans via relationships with others.
How did you come to relational psychoanalysis as an orientation?
I was trained as a classical analyst, and I had left my classical institute when it was doing what a lot of institutes have done, which was fighting with itself, within itself, and splitting into a couple of different institutes and different camps. And something very radical had happened in this classical institute. Somebody had suggested that they introduce object relations curriculum, which of course, I know it was scandalous at the time. I'm in a classical ego psych institute. But at any rate, I was feeling a little burnt out analytically. And then came the second George Bush's invasion of Afghanistan. And a lot of my psychotherapist and psychoanalyst colleagues were quite disturbed by what they felt was concerted effort to terrify the public, right? You remember those days with the different color-coded alerts that were freaking many of us out and perhaps unnecessarily, and concerned about the aggression and the war. At any rate, a group formed, Psychotherapists for Social Responsibility. And it just so happens that the leaders of that group were Jessica Benjamin, Neil Altman, psychotherapists and psychoanalysts who identified as relational. I hadn't heard of relational. My analysis as a patient was quite classical, and I hadn't heard of it. So I went to the group, though, because I was feeling traumatized by what was going on, by 9/11, by the subsequent war responses. And I went to the meetings and I met some relational analysts, and I started learning, and I worked on some position pieces for the group. And I began my initially informal and then more formal education in relational psychoanalysis. I taught myself. I found some supervisors. I eventually started an elective at an institute that hadn't had any and developed some courses. I'm sure you know yourself. One of the best ways to learn sometimes is to teach.
It's a really interesting story. I mean, we spent a whole season of the show last season exploring the place of societal trauma and things we see in the news in treatment, in the treatment room. And as a what they call a geriatric millennial, it doesn't seem very controversial to me. Have you heard that term before?
No, I love it so much. I can't tell you.
I'm an old millennial. It makes sense to me. It's interesting to hear it as a foundational reason for you moving in that direction.
And you know from your geriatric millennial perspective that your elders were indoctrinated into a very different way of thinking. Really, even in social work school, I was lucky enough to go to clinical social work program, grad school, that was psychoanalytically oriented, but it was certainly classically analytically oriented. And then in my institute training, politics and society and culture were to be kept out. We followed Freud to the letter of the law, at least Freud on paper.
Right.
So this was a brand new world. My colleagues and psychotherapists for social responsibility were saying, this is a mental health crisis. That was enlivening me. That was helping to combat the burnout I had been feeling, because hiding oneself, which classical teaching emphasizes, takes a toll, obviously.
I was barely an adult when 9/11 happened, but it was still clear to me that it was a mental health crisis. Not only the fantasies of safety and separation from the world that were shattered on that day, but the understanding of our own exceptionalism and how we as Americans were perceived. And then, of course, the incredible folly that colored our response, leaving a geopolitical mark that still resonates across the world. This was the palpable memory for me on October 7th, 2023. As I turned on the news to stories of Israeli concert goers being abducted by Hamas soldiers, it was not only a sense of terror at the thought of me or my children being held accountable for the cruelty of my government, but it was fear of what was about to come next. And then a sense of hopelessness towards the staggering inevitability of violence. Burnout is something that I've experienced and something that I think a lot about, and I think the stance of the two-person psychology seems to be extremely important to not experiencing burnout, in my experience.
Well put. I really agree. For me, that's part of the crucial importance of the analyst subjectivity, the therapist as a person. I tend to use the words therapist and analyst interchangeably. So yeah, the therapist subjectivity is a way of the therapist staying alive in the room, right? What does it do to us to listen to patients all day? I think it makes it very easy to burn out, to dissociate prior to burnout, to dissociate. We'd like to think it's an opportunity for reverie that we can use in the work, and it can be at times, but not always. But when we can find ways to make space for ourselves that don't impinge on the patient, and that becomes part of my theory as well, then I think we've got a better chance at really being with the patient for the long haul.
Well, that's interesting. What are some ways you've explored that therapists can avoid that dissociation?
There's something I call silent disclosure. And I mean by that, when we self-disclose, not out loud to a patient, though, to ourselves. And I believe that that is a necessity in response to a dissociative state or a potential dissociative state in the therapist as a way to stop the dissociation or prevent it.
Can I ask more about that?
So there's a case example that I give when I first started writing a little bit about the notion of silent disclosure. I mentioned a situation where a patient is talking about his mother's serious illness. And as he's talking, I find myself kind of numbing out, to put it in more colloquial terms, and starting to dissociate, certainly feeling deadened, right? If I was truly fully dissociated, I wouldn't know. But I feel these processes kind of brewing, or perhaps I was dissociated and then came back for a moment. And I started thinking about my mother, who had around that time been very ill. And I started thinking about the fact that this particular patient, not all of our patients, but this man appreciated when I deliberately disclosed one thing or another here or there. And I obviously disclose a lot in my writing. Sometimes in my teaching or supervising, I'm a little more on the conservative end of it with patients than some of my relational colleagues. At any rate, this is all silently, right? I wonder how many seconds it actually was.
Right.
And I tell myself, okay, I'm going to tell him a little something about my mother, that she's been ill. I'm not going to get into details. I thought it might be a way to join him. And I write about this. So as I start to think about telling him and maybe what words I would use, I start to get shaken up. There's quite a lot of affect enters the field, or at least enters my psyche. And I decide, no way, I'm not going to speak about this. But I had made a disclosure by that point to myself, right? I had practiced some words and some sentiment that I was going to deliberately share with this man. And that's what I call a silent disclosure. And making that disclosure silently, it's disclosing to myself, is disclosing to my patient in my internal world, I was returned to the treatment. I was no longer dead. I was no longer flattened, right? The dissociation had dissipated as a result of this. And I was with him. We could argue that, in fact, as my eyes started to get a bit moist, which I think was probably happening, he might have seen that. Maybe I did it would have been an inadvertent disclosure at that point, I guess, not a deliberate one. Much of the process was a silent or internal one. And that's part of what excites me about looking at the analyst or the therapist's subjectivity, right? How do we work with our own subjectivity so we stay more alive in the room, more connected to the patient, more able to do the work over many months and years and decades sometimes with each of our patients? And I don't believe psychoanalysis has done a good enough job at figuring out a way to hold ourselves and feed ourselves in the here and now.
I understand that what Steve is talking about here is an internal process in the mind of the therapist, one in which a disclosure is made between subject and internal object as a way of reassociating. In a way, it's almost like he orients himself to the other in his mind, similar to his interpretation of my comment about inputting subjectivity into this podcast or through editing. We find ourselves in others. I hear this piece and understand it, but I also think about all the silent disclosing I do that is still intuited by my patient externally. I told him about a patient who knew what I was thinking when I wasn't saying it. He came in one week and proudly told me that he had made some progress on the building of boundaries with his family. I probably looked perplexed because I don't talk about boundaries in therapy. It's not a word I use, really, and we had not been working on it. He proceeded to tell me that the boundary he had enforced is that he would not let his 4-year-old pick the movie they watched for family movie night. The child wanted to watch a cartoon, and the father wanted to watch a dramatic movie. An argument with the child ensued, and it ended in tears, but the father was proud he had enforced the rule. He told this to me, and I held back my opinions and stiffly asked questions. I was thinking about his cruelty to the child, as well as his cruelty to the child parts of himself. I wondered where the message that he needed to be more forceful about this subject in particular had come from, because it wasn't from our work. Back to my interview with Steve. I held it all in. And then the following week, the patient came back and said, "You didn't like that story."
It's great. Were you surprised when they said that?
I was very surprised, but they knew that I had.
They totally knew. And they do know. They know so much more about us than we want to acknowledge.
Mm-hmm.
Can we tolerate that? Most of us go into this field in some part because we're motivated by hiding or subjugating ourselves to the other. And when we find out that, in fact, we're not able to hide, while I think it can be a relief on some level, it also makes many of us feel very vulnerable, how seen we are.
Mm-hmm.
And for those of us who are working under the burden of feeling like we have to be healthier, quotes around that, than the patient, that can be disturbing, certainly unnerving in some ways, because it means that our patients will see that we're not so together or resolved.
Yeah. At
this point in my work, when a patient will say something like, "I'm so glad you're not judgmental," or "It's important to me to have some," I will sometimes challenge that. Sometimes that might be a transferential need that they have to see me as not judgmental, but we are judgmental. You were judgmental with that patient around their cartoon censorship.
Right.
And can that be okay? Can we forgive ourselves?
What is the subjectivity that you bring to the work that causes you to think the way that you think and to treat the patients you treat?
Most or all of us who are trained classically, the therapist's subjectivity was treated as an artifact to bury. If our subjective needs and desires and interests emerged in the treatment of our patients, it meant that we hadn't been analyzed well enough. That really was the belief, even as recently as the 70s or 80s, and it's still the belief for some more classical colleagues. My own belief was that we were missing huge amounts of diagnostic data, right? We know that what gets stirred in us is very often a data point, potentially. It's very often projected or dissociated material from the client that is now living in us in some form. We know that it's important to track who we are because of the impact it has on our patients, right? So had you not been open to hearing your clients' feedback about your reaction to the cartoon, which a lot of more classical analysts might not have been, you would have missed a chance to really know how your patient experienced you and therefore who they are in a more fully dimensional way and who you are to them and so on. At any rate, I started realizing that there were a lot of problems in this way of thinking and working. I also started realizing in my students and supervisees who had been trained more recently and in a more contemporary milieu than I had been, they were still burdened in some part with this attitude, right? Because even if they were learning in a more contemporary setting, their therapists and their therapists' teachers and therapists had been taught the way my colleagues and I had been taught. So I think that it's really a neglected area of study, the therapist's subjectivity. And it also makes us more vulnerable, right? So most of the literature on who we are as people is presented in particular cases around enactment, impasse, but not as a full book or a full article, even though it was introduced by Stephen Mitchell and his followers when relational psychoanalysis, big R relational, I should say, was developed.
In the way that the theories say more about the theorists sometimes than the reality, what makes you that way?
I was told to hide who I was. We were all told to hide who we were in the classroom to the extent that we were being trained in a classical model that attempted what I now know is impossible, that attempted neutrality, right? But that lesson, hide who you are, had a particular resonance for me, who, when I was first training, was struggling to figure out my sexual orientation and other elements of who I was as a person, as a human. And certainly had a particular resonance later as I was arriving at more of a clear discovery. And, you know, in the psychoanalytic climate in the 70s and 80s, and certainly earlier than that, originally lesbian and gay analysts couldn't be trained. They were not allowed to train at the analytic institutes. And we now look back on that in horror, but there is still some residue of that. I think this was the early 90s. A colleague of mine said something about referring to a gay psychoanalyst. And her thought was she probably wouldn't hesitate, but the patient would have to be gay. Now, this is the 90s. That gives you some sense of where thinking has been.
But how does that speak to objectivity and neutrality?
Right, good question.
If the training teaches us to be neutral and objective, then why would it matter?
Good question. Because of the contention that homosexuality was pathology. We had Freud's letter, Freud's beautiful, wonderful letter to the mother of, right? The mother of a gay or homosexual, he was called, boy, in which Freud is not pathologizing. And it's fantastic. But some of his theory can be read, especially some of his earlier theory can be read as pathology, some of his followers. And there was some psychoanalytic teaching that the only mentally healthy, psychologically healthy form of sex, and therefore identity, was male, female, penile, vaginal intercourse. That's it. I mean, really, you can be heterosexual and pathological if that's not your game, but that extends to sexual identity and laws against training people who were LGBTQ.
I mean, I'm only preaching to the choir these days, but I still do not understand in that for that to make sense, you have to accept many cognitive dissonances, but for that to make sense, the subjectivity of the analyst must matter.
That's what we were up against, and it meant that you had to hide who you were. I remember we had an analytic conference that this first institute I studied at, I think it was boycotted by ACT UP. It was an AIDS funding and research group. And I didn't understand it at the time. And I identified with my institute. I was very opposed to it. But I later realized that one of our faculty was lecturing on the pathology of lesbian lifestyle. And this group had found out and was protesting. So this is how I grew up analytically. Hide the subjectivity, hide the person of the therapist, because that's the only way to be neutral. Hide the person of the therapist if the therapist happens to be part of a group that has been marginalized and pathologized, literally pathologized. So hide the subjectivity then. Hide the subjectivity if you're getting satisfaction from your work. It used to be taught that if we felt satisfied in our clinical work, it meant we were somehow taking advantage of the patient and our own needs were getting met. That was a no-no. It was, and still to some extent is, a Spartan pursuit and potentially masochistic if we don't feel like we can take pleasure in the work. I want to be able to laugh. I want to be able to be human and real. I don't want to burden my patients with deliberate disclosures of my subjectivity when I can help it. I try to help it. Do I contort myself so as not to have that happen? Well, on a bad day, yeah, I still carry some of that in me. I find it touching to see how many of us, even those of us who are part of the majority and are identify as hetero perhaps, and who are trained more recently, how many of us feel guilty or anxious about the analytic police coming and catching us indulge too much in our subjectivities.
In Roy Barsness's book, Core Competencies of Relational Psychoanalysis, Steve writes the postscript to Chapter 17. He's responding to John Mill's criticisms of relational psychoanalysis, and he shows his chops for understanding the history and emergence of this school of thought. He writes, Jay Greenberg and Stephen Mitchell first coined the term relational, small r, as a way of identifying a common theme among a diverse group of theories that had not previously been considered connected or unified in any way. Each of the schools that appeared under the new umbrella of relational, which are primarily interpersonal, object relations, self-psychology, and intersubjective theory, emphasized a person's embeddedness in the social context rather than the isolated individual as the primary unit of study. But it wasn't until his first solo-authored book that Mitchell began using the term relational to also refer to a newly developing perspective, in some ways overlapping with but also distinct from the earlier theories that he and Greenberg had included under the heading of relational psychoanalysis. Mitchell's new thinking rose from the melding of Fairbairn's object relations theory with interpersonal psychoanalysis, feminist, queer, gender, and other social theories, and is now sometimes referred to as the New York School or North American Relational Psychoanalysis. This new and expanded perspective also became referred to as Big R relational psychoanalysis in order to distinguish it from Mitchell's original use of the term relational. I'm aware that feminist and queer theory have had an influence on contemporary relational psychoanalysis, and it feels right. I don't know if I know how to explain what that influence might be.
As Mitchell and his colleagues were developing Big R relational psychoanalysis, they based this way of working and thinking on a combining of British object relations theory, especially Fairbairn's internal objects theory, with Sullivan and Fromm and others' version of interpersonal psychoanalysis. Those are the two main analytic schools that came together. But he brought in voices like Jessica Benjamin, eventually Muriel Dimon, and others who were feminists. They were feminist analysts. These analysts and others like them looked at the pathologizing of women, right? We've been talking about the pathologizing of the LGBTQ population, but there has also in classical psychoanalysis been a seeing of women as kind of subservient to men, and women as not as agentic, and women as wishing they were men, and on and on. These theorists, like Jessica, really challenged that. So Mitchell and his close colleagues included a feminist perspective. They also included a sociocultural political perspective, and they wanted to look at the therapist as a person, so subjectivity to some extent. Now, some interpersonal analysts were doing this, but they were still doing it, and of course, interpersonal psychoanalysis precedes relational work, but they were doing it from a one-person perspective mostly, meaning the focus is only on the patient, not the analyst as well. And relational psychoanalysis did this more actively. So women are included more, and women write not just as mothers. One of the areas that Jessica and her colleagues was looking at was motherhood and how automatically the subjectivity of the mother gets lost. And she drew some parallels with the analyst, right, where the subjectivity of the analyst can get lost. Mm-hmm. And that can be a developmental achievement that the patient eventually sees the therapist as a separate object and separate subjectivity. And so too with the child and their mother. So too with society and women, hopefully.
The subjectivity that you bring of the reaction to wanting to hide. I was reading actually your critique of the critique in Roy Barsness's book, and it called to mind the section on disclosure. And I think your point was you don't know any relational psychoanalysts, big R relationists, who would claim that it's not something to be hyper aware of, hyper vigilant about. How does that influence how you think about disclosure? You've had this place of growth for yourself in terms of being taught not to show yourself.
Yeah, exactly. Deliberate self-disclosure is not something to take lightly. We want to try to think about it and be conscious about it when our psyche allows. I would say, if anything, I have not learned well enough the importance or the ease around deliberate self-disclosure. Inadvertent disclosure, we all have no choice about it. I think we do well to try to acknowledge how often that happens. But in terms of deliberate disclosure, I'm not as comfortable with it. I find myself still a little bit more critical of what I see as a sometimes casual approach to it on the part of some therapists. Having said that, the longer I practice and work, the more okay with it as a legitimate option I am. And I mean, not just theoretically, but also for myself. Part of working with the therapist subjectivity is to figure out who each of us is. For some of us, were we not to deliberately disclose, we would be less authentic in the room. Mm-hmm. And while I think all of us have the obligation to try to protect our patients from impingement by us, which deliberate disclosure sometimes causes, for some of us to not disclose is to carry an internal psychic burden and pressure that probably doesn't serve the patient very well. And conversely, for some of us, to disclose makes us feel more vulnerable and exposed than may be best for our authentic selves, and therefore than may be best for our patients.
I talked with Steve about a case that comes up a few times from here on out in this season. Later in the season, I'll talk with Israeli-American psychoanalyst Orna Goralnik about her work with a particular couple who was Palestinian and Lebanese, and her similar disclosure to them. A patient of mine who was gay, who worked with me for some time before finding out that I wasn't gay. He had talked in intimate detail about his sex life, and I could tell that he was taken aback to realize that he had been talking to a straight man this way all that time. I realized that maybe I was the symbol of his abuser, and it changed the way I thought about these kinds of disclosures. I decided from there on out to disclose that I identified as an ally early on.
John, do you mean he was hurt by the fact that you hadn't told him?
I think he was hurt by the fact that he had talked so freely with an assumption about me that turned out to not be true.
And that you hadn't corrected it, maybe.
Yeah.
Sure. See, I think we're caught in a tough spot in those clinical moments. Mm-hmm. To have corrected it is to interfere with the transference and perhaps the patient's needs. To not correct it eventually can feel like a betrayal of the patient. And I don't know that there's a right or a wrong there. My own tendency would probably be, if you and I had been talking about that case a while back, my own tendency probably would have been closer to what you did. But you and I now can certainly imagine a counter argument that would make sense too. What does it mean if a patient needs us to be gay and we're straight, or needs us to be straight and we're gay? Now, most of us are not just one thing or another. Right. To the extent that I identify as gay, I have probably more internal objects, many more internal objects and identifications that are hetero or bi. So in some respects, I think labels fall short.
And I find that dilemma with other categories of identity as well, religious, and it's only natural to come into the office with a lot of assumptions or understandings about someone that you don't actually know that much about.
Yes, exactly. Not too long ago, a patient referenced my wife. So a somewhat similar situation, I think, to what you're describing. I didn't correct him, but my question to myself was, am I not correcting him because he clearly needs to see me as having a wife for whatever reasons that may be? Why would I burden him with external reality when we're there to look at his internal world? Or was I not correcting him because of my own pleasure in being seen as a category that isn't marginalized and in fact is the dominant straight white man? It doesn't get much more powerful and privileged than that. But to not correct him left me feeling inauthentic and closeted and hiding. To correct him, I think would have been more my own need. But as I'm saying, I'm also in touch with my own need to have not corrected him. It will come back to get dealt with at some point for the two of us, I'm sure, just the way it did with you and your patient.
Whose need are we meeting?
Exactly. And I think that's always an important question. Now, sometimes when we're meeting our own need, that is a way of meeting the patient's need, to the extent that we have the kind of feeding and holding that is required in a job that really takes its toll on us, psychically at least, if not physically, by sitting and listening for so many hours a day. So when we can meet our own needs, we very often meet those of our patients. Having said that, when does our own so-called healthy needs, when does that bleed into more narcissistic or pathologically narcissistic, I should say, needs?
Can you give me an example of what a healthy narcissistic need might be on the analyst part?
To be listened to be appreciated, to be considered as a subject, maybe to be admired, the things that we as humans need, but don't always get from or feel with our patients. So while it might not, and often isn't, appropriate to get those needs met by our patients, we might still be aware of a longing or a desire for it at times. And the nature of the work leads to a certain level of deprivation and frustration of our own needs. We are there to privilege the need of our patient. And that's why I think things like silent disclosure, enough time off and vacation time, freedom to scream or cry in our mind's eye, that becomes necessary because this work takes a toll.
In 2022, Steve edited, along with biographer Linda Hopkins, Diary of a Fallen Psychoanalyst, the workbooks of Masood Khan. Khan was a disciple of D.W. Winnicott, and later in his life was excommunicated from the psychoanalytic community. In the preface to this collection of his writings, Kuchuck and Hopkins write, Masood Khan is remembered in mostly negative ways these days. Despite his major contributions to the analytic world, he is, especially in his later years, summarized as a braggart, a liar, an analyst who slept with his patients, a bigot, an anti-Semite, and, in his last 5 years specifically, a mad alcoholic who destroyed his accomplishments, but even his critics acknowledge his brilliance as a writer and thinker. As Eric Rayner said to Linda Hopkins, Masood's soul came from the devil and his writing came from the gods. Rayner's words capture Khan as a true paradox in the Winnicottian sense, where paradox, not conflict, is the essence of human life. He was a wonderful, terrible, magnificent, disgusting man who influenced people in different and major ways. He was a devoted and beloved friend and analyst to quite a few people, at the same time as he was deeply flawed and in later years caused great harm to his patients and others. What brought you to Masood Khan?
Yeah, Linda Hopkins and I put together selections of his diary entries. He called his professional diaries workbooks.
It sounds like a fascinating story, and I don't know if this is ignorant of me, but it's a name that I had not heard.
I think it's very representative of a problem in psychoanalysis, which is that when somebody falls out of favor, as Khan well should have, and thank goodness did, we often throw the baby out with the bathwater, meaning that because he became a scandalized figure, which I can speak to, his brilliant theories were lost to the extent that they were not taught. We know the same thing, of course, happened to Jung, and it certainly happened to Ferenczi. Ferenczi is another person that I've done some work on. And I guess my interest in some of these theorists grows out of or is related to my interest in who we therapists are as people. The analyst subjectivity extends to a historical level as well.
I know about Ferenczi, but he fell out of favor as well.
I think in some ways Ferenczi's falling out of favor was much less deserved and more about power and hierarchy and narcissism in a very limited psychoanalytic world and sphere in Ferenczi's time. Adrian Harris and I edited a collection of papers by colleagues who wrote about Ferenczi's influence on their work. Ferenczi really is the grandfather of current psychoanalysis and relational psychoanalysis. However, he made the mistake of disagreeing with Father Freud, analyst and teacher and mentor and friend. And disagreeing with Freud meant stirring the wrath of Freud's closest followers like Ernest Jones and others who then marginalized Ferenczi. But Ferenczi was terrific. Masood Khan was working primarily in the 70s, 80s, or late 60s onward. He came from what is now Pakistan. In his early 20s, moved to London to pursue a master's in English literature, I believe. He was a brilliant, brilliant guy. And so the story goes, applied for treatment at the British Psychoanalytical Association. The way Khan tells the story, and Khan could lie like the best liars, so we don't always know what's accurate or not. The way Khan tells the story, his request for treatment was misunderstood, and they thought he was applying for training and offered him a slot in training. He became the youngest analyst to ever train at the British Psychoanalytic. One of his analysts, his main analyst, was D.W. Winnicott. And Khan and Winnicott became initially patient and analyst, but then colleagues and friends. And Khan was a brilliant psychoanalytic editor. He was one of the editors of the International Journal of Psychoanalysis. He edited a book series.
Do you feel a personal connection?
You should be a therapist. Do I feel a person? I do. I can only acknowledge it with many, many caveats because I think he was probably a horrendous guy in many ways, Khan. But he had a passion for psychoanalytic study and psychoanalytic literature and writing and editing and teaching that I have and that I feel. And he complains in his diaries about overextending himself and feeling like his own writing is going to be neglected because he committed to writing an intro to someone's book or editing someone's paper. And truthfully, I feel less alone in some of my own struggles and complaints. Like a lot of us, it's easier to say yes to interesting, exciting opportunities than no sometimes. And Khan seemed to have struggled with that as well. So yes, in some ways I identify with him, and in some ways I disidentify with him actively. So part of the tragedy, I think, of Khan's psychoanalytic treatment and development as an analyst was that the dual relationships that he engaged in. So he became Winnicott's editor, not just his patient. Some people think he might have helped Winnicott write some of Winnicott's papers. It seems very likely. Yeah. Khan, I don't think that Khan says this, but he certainly helped Winnicott to some extent with his writing. His last analyst, the last analyst for just a brief period for Khan after Winnicott died, was Anna Freud. So he's a fascinating figure in the history of psychoanalysis, and his diaries are very exciting for any of us that want to gain insights into Winnicott. He has a passage in the diaries, Khan does, where he said, one of the very few times I really felt an authentic sense of myself, a real deep connection to myself, is when I laid my head in Winnicott's lap or on Winnicott's leg. I'm paraphrasing here, John. I heard the ticking of Winnicott's stopwatch in his pocket and the beating of my own heart. And he describes something so beautiful there.
And also a bit disturbing.
Yes.
Both.
Yes, disturbing, but there's so much disturbing about Khan that...
tip of the iceberg.
Almost not disturbing by comparison. And in some ways, it's beautiful and moving. Kahn wrote about perversion. You asked me about my interest in subjectivity, and we write what resonates affectively for us. Kahn wrote about perversion. Sadly, tragically, he had sexual liaisons with some patients, more than one patient. He had an ongoing affair with at least one patient, maybe more. And he was eventually kicked out of the British Psychoanalytical, I would say too late, unfortunately. He should have been pushed out sooner. He descended into horrible alcoholism in his later years, which he writes about in the diaries. He writes about his struggle to stop. So I believe psychoanalysis let him down in some ways. He certainly let psychoanalysis down. And Winnicott, as his analyst, I really think Winnicott was not able to be helpful to Kahn in the ways that Kahn needed. Kahn also needed alcohol, specific alcohol treatment, to whatever extent that existed in those days.
If the stories are true about him helping Winnicott with his writings, I also think about there being a colonial trope in the appropriation. It's hard not to see the kind of racial dynamic, if that is a true story.
Wow, that one is pretty true. Well, that's really interesting. I agree completely. That's been overshadowed for me by Winnicott colonializing of Kahn in other ways. Just the fact that he was his analyst. But that's a really interesting way to look at it. Kahn is a beautiful writer. He spoke and wrote fluently in a number of languages, a brilliant thinker, and a very disturbed and unfortunately, eventually dangerous anti-Semitic, anti-American, anti-British.
Misanthrope?
Yeah, exactly. Generous in his anti-stances.
In his diaries, Masood Khan writes, on June 6, 1968, Robert Kennedy died, another American murderous triumph over humanism. The real cause of eruptive murderous violence against liberal individuals in America derives from a simple fact. Here is the most powerful militaristic nation of our century that by its own overt and avowed ethos is committed against military conquest. This has never happened before in the history of peoples and nations. Powerful nations have conquered others, then exploited and conditionally nurtured them and gradually decayed, and perished, and prided themselves for it. America has won wars and victories, but not asserted its right to explicit possession and triumph from power. Hence, its strength has never found a validity in facts mirrored by the humbled pride of others. Instead, its power has expressed itself by devious economic imperialism and pseudo-reparative intrusions of political idealism. In these, there is a shame and guilt mixed with devious gain and not explicit endorsement of aggressively achieved self-esteem.
What drew me to Kahn, at least consciously, was his pivotal position in the history of psychoanalysis. He knew everyone. He worked with the Freud family, not just Anna Freud, but also, I think it was Ernst Freud. He knew Martin Freud, a couple of Freud's sons who kept the legacy of Freud's work. He was working with them to release some of Freud's writing in newer editions. He gossips about people outside of psychoanalysis, like the Redgraves, Julie Andrews, he's friends with. He hobnobs with some very interesting people, Mike Nichols, in the arts and in psychoanalysis. So I find him fascinating. I think on a more unconscious level, which is not as unconscious as it used to be, damn it. I think I see, as you were pointing to, maybe some identifications with some of his work interests and passions, and certainly something about his badness allows all of us to embrace our goodness, right? It's a very convenient split when we can identify someone bad as a defensive maneuver to feel more of our own good. Now, with Ferenczi, my interest in Ferenczi is more around how he really was in his own way, practicing as a relational analyst. His biggest ethical failure, I might put it, was an experiment that he had with at least one patient in which they took turns on the couch in response to his patient's request that they do this. But of course, as the analyst, it's our job to keep the hierarchical disparity, right? That's Lou Aaron and others who write about asymmetry.
Symmetrical asymmetry, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. With this patient, the session would be an hour or two, and they would divide the time where she was on the couch and he would analyze her, and then he would go on the couch and she would analyze him. Now, on the surface of it, this sounds crazy. I think it sounds crazy, and is certainly a boundary problem and therefore an ethical problem. But he caught himself fairly quickly and decided this was not an effective way to work. He stopped it. But what I think he tried to retain, and what the next generation of his followers, his patients and their patients and so on, what we all inherited, I'd like to think, is an idea of mutuality, that we need to invite our patients to wonder about our psyches. What might they be able to see in us that we're not seeing in ourselves? We don't do it by laying on the couch and taking their time that they're paying for to analyze us. But we do work with the derivative of a Ferenzi's experiment.
Yeah, clearly you seem protective of him. If Khan is the scapegoat and the someone who we can, identify our badness in, Ferenczi seems more like the little brother that we want to protect from the bullies.
Very much so. That's great. Very much so. Ferenczi pleaded with his analyst, Freud, to be more human, to disclose more, to share more, to be more affective and loving with him. He said, that's what I need from you. But, Freud was more of a scientific man who tried to hold affect to the side in his work. Ferenczi also worked with disenfranchised populations. He worked with LGBTQ patients who were not always getting access to services. He worked with transgender people.
Ahead of his time.
He was ahead of his time, exactly.
Just curious about, it's very interesting to me where that comes from for you, these characters that have fallen out of favor with psychoanalysis.
I just read a quote from Erwin Yalom saying that analysts have to embrace their dark sides, and only by doing so can they empathize with their patients' darkness and troubles and such. That's where the sequestering or the dissociating from who we are as humans in terms of our own needs and vulnerabilities, that's where it becomes dangerous, right? When we can't acknowledge, as Yalom is saying here, our dark side. So then we've got Sullivan's great quote, of course, we are all much more human than otherwise. So there's so many ways of wording this, and yet I think that message gets lost too often because we hold ourselves to such a high standard. I think it's Racker who talks about the analytic myth. The analytic myth is the healthy analyst treats the ill patient. I think if that's the ethos that we're working with, the standard that we think we're supposed to meet, it means that we're going to have to dissociate at times from our dark side, as Yalom puts it. And that's dangerous. If we can't acknowledge our neediness, our selfishness, our desires, our repulsions, whatever, when we can't acknowledge those elements of who we are, our patients are in potential trouble. So that's my kind of song about subjectivity.
You talked about the kind of unconscious motives that lead people into this field as something about hiding. I think we also want to know our goodness and have it be known.
Absolutely. Absolutely. We're afraid people won't refer to us if they don't think we are incredible. The most boring party one can ever go to.
Yes.
Right, is a party of therapists and or analysts where everyone is being so careful about what they show. So, I've been part of analytic communities where it's a little more relaxed and fun, but I've also been part of communities where there is such a hyper self-consciousness and fear of showing who we are, even to each other outside of the treatment room, or maybe especially to each other. Right.
I'm breaking radio host character because this is something I complain incessantly about to my wife. It's like, I don't want to go to that therapist party.
100%. I get it. I so get it. Exactly. So I think it's our fear of being human and flawed and feeling. But of course, like a lot of things, it becomes a paradox. Because the more we think it's not okay to be human and vulnerable and flawed and to be imperfect, the less able we sometimes are to look at it in ourselves. And once we can't go there and really examine these and hopefully forgive ourselves, right? There's a way to hold ourselves responsible while hopefully also forgiving our imperfections where appropriate. If we can't do that, we're not going to grow. We're not going to be able to help our patients. Mal Slavin and Daniel Kriegman have an incredibly beautiful, important paper from many years ago. Part of the title is Why the Analyst Needs to Change, but they explore the therapist's literal need, not desire, not passion, but psychic need to heal and rescue. And what happens to us if we don't feel effective with our patients, if we're not effective with our patients for whatever reasons, and how the origins of this really are in our childhoods. The patient will sometimes say, I don't know why I did that. I don't know why that happened, right? Patients don't know why. We don't know why. Mm-hmm. There have been times when I hear the patient say that, and I hear my parents' voice. I think it was both of them, but I know it was my father's. Well, if you don't know, then who should I ask? I feel that voice stirring sometimes. Now, I think what usually, if not, I hope always happens in those cases is I feel a level of empathy, right, with my patient, because now there's two of us that don't know, perhaps, right? So much of our work involves not knowing and tolerating not knowing. But I'm interested in how our parents show up, and they can show up in some positive ways too. In this example, though, my child self is there too, right? And to the extent that I can have some empathy for my child self in relation to, well, then who should I ask? When my patient exclaims, I just don't know, then there's an opportunity to do some self-reparative work, right? As we empathize with our patients' feelings of frustration or upset, possibly embarrassment about not knowing something that has been asked.
Right.
As we can show up for them in ways that perhaps my parents couldn't in some of those moments, I think something very interesting happens. I have a patient who told me he imagines I must have had a really nurturing, wonderful grandmother. Now he's skipping a generation. He's right, though. How does he feel my grandmother in the room? And I think my mother as well. So our parents, and I guess in this case, our grandparents, sometimes show in the room.
That brings me back to silent disclosure. There's something you're doing and he's insightful enough to pick up on it.
Interesting. Yeah, he feels her in the room.
Yeah.
Feels her in the room, and then I feel her in the room. It's nice to have her around, usually. See, then I have to be aware of the parts of my grandmother and my mother that could potentially be impinging or suffocating, that might, in fact, ask one too many times, has he been wearing a helmet when he rides his bike? Which I can do with some of my patients, right? So then we have to kind of keep an eye on how far into the room are our parents.
In his latest solo authored book, The Relational Revolution in Psychoanalysis and Psychotherapy, Steve writes, there is, of course, a tremendous irony that our profession's not too long ago, and for some still current, ego ideal was to hide the analyst's true or at least less censored self, or what we now call the analyst self-states, as part of the process of helping patients to come out of hiding and uncover a more expansive and fully realized self. I had early teachers and supervisors stress the importance of making sure that emotions never registered on my face, assuring that office and personal dress were completely neutral, and seeing to it that for the sake of the patient, the analyst's personal needs were always suppressed. As mentioned, abstinence, even to the point of erasing ourselves, seemed to be the key in those days. Although less and less emphasized by many, it is still an essential goal for some analysts. I know the toll that the hiding and attempts at total neutrality took on me and colleagues. I worry about the toll it took on my patients. And if we accept the fact that no matter how far we have come, most of us still operate with some residue of this archaic analytic superego, we know the toll it might continue to take on our students and patients. Here's Steve talking about his book.
As far as I know, it's the first individually authored book that attempts to serve as a textbook or overview of big R relational psychoanalysis. Roy Barsness did an incredible and an important job in his book on relational psychoanalysis that he wrote sections of and worked with other writers on. A lot of what I appreciate about Roy's book, among many things, is that there's an enactment of a relational ethos to the extent that he invited multiple voices in, which is how Stephen Mitchell hoped relational psychoanalysis would evolve. He hoped that it would be the first theoretical perspective that would be discovered or developed by multiple voices, right? We look at every other school of psychoanalysis and it's a singular voice that leads it. What I try to do in this book is the book is written primarily for psychotherapists and psychoanalysts, with an attempt to be somewhat approachable for an educated lay public who might have a question about psychoanalysis and more specifically relational psychoanalysis. It's short and hopefully accessible. And what I attempt to do is to cover the main points that define relational psychoanalysis. Self-states, the analyst's subjectivity, obviously, self-disclosure, enactment, a number of core principles, as Roy calls them, that help to define relational psychoanalysis. I was asked to write the book in a relatively brief format for a relatively broad audience. And my own mission for the book was to have an overview of an area of work that most of us struggle to define. It's not as hard to define classical theory, object relations theory, interpersonal. It's harder because relational psychoanalysis is different depending on who practices it. Tony Bass's is very heavily colored by interpersonal theory, and deliberate disclosure is a more common go-to for him. Jessica's relational psychoanalysis is different. It's much more about injury and repair and about feminist and other kinds of philosophical principles. My version of relational is much more about analysts as a person and their subjectivity. Neil Altman's focuses more on race and class. We each approach it differently. I don't know if you have so much diversity in the other schools, at least not explicitly.
I see your work that you're doing as that very important kind of custodial work or guardianship of that canon. And it's also nice to read it when it's actually your words. And all that to say, I'm happy to have been able to have a chance to talk to you.
Oh, those are nice words. I appreciate it. It's been fun for me. I feel some of the kinship and resonances. It's funny, I had a fantasy that it would be fun to interview you. And I think that this came out of something you said, that we can discover ourselves through relating to others, right? And as we discover others and who they are as subjects, we understand things about ourselves. And that's part of the excitement and fun in talking like this. So I appreciate the opportunity.
Steve, thanks so much for being on the show.
It was really fun. Thank you for having me. Appreciate it.
This has been Between Us. Our thanks to our guest, Stephen Kuchuck. Between Us is produced by myself and Mason Neely, who also composes our music. Our research assistant is Rose Bergdoll. Find Between Us where you find podcasts and subscribe. If you liked the show, leave a review. And until next time, take care.